The room wasn't full, but it was loud. Not in volumino one shouted, but in the quiet thud of assumptions. Chairs creaked, papers rustled, and beneath it all, the hum of familiarity. Another committee meeting and a long line of policy discussions that pretended to change things. Mike Johnson sat near the center, a man who wore decorum like armor. His tie was perfectly centered, his lapel pin polished, his Bible tucked neatly under one elbow like an accessory from a campaign ad. When he cleared his throat, aides turned. When he smiled, photographers clicked. And when he stood, the room always sat a little straighter, not because of respect, but because of what power demands. That day, he introduced a new proposal, cleanly titled Harmless in Tone, the Reverence in Education Act. He called it a defense of unity, a safeguard against ideological division in schools, a return to moral grounding. What he didn't say, what the text of the bill did say, was that any public school curriculum, including references to systemic racism, the legacy of slavery, or the lived experience of marginalized communities, would be subject to state-level review, parental veto, and potential loss of federal funding. On paper, it sounded procedural, but the words were landmines, and Jasmine Crockett knew it the moment she read them. She didn't say anything that first day. She sat 3 seats away, flipping through the early draft like a surgeon reading a death certificate. She didn't look up when Johnson said, "We must teach children love of country, not shame of it." She didn't respond when he quoted scripture again from Proverbs, "Train up a child in the way he should go." She didn't even blink. But inside her chest, something small and ancient twisted. The kind of ache you feel not because someone screamed at you, but because they decided your story wasn't worth remembering. Johnson didn't look at her, not directly, but he knew she was there. That was part of the theater, to speak in sweeping abstractions while never addressing the people who would bear the weight of his words. He didn't need to say Black history. He didn't need to say critical race theory. The target was known. The silence did the aiming for him. Later that night, the headlines were predictable. Speaker Johnson unveils values-based education bill. New legislation aims to protect children from divisive narratives. Conservatives applaud return to neutral curriculum standards. Neutral. That word crawled beneath Jasmine's skin like a mosquito that wouldn't die. Because she had lived long enough to know what neutral really meant, in the mouths of men like Johnson, it meant history with the mirrors removed. The next day, in a hallway that smelled like old coffee and political compromise, Jasmine ran into Representative Carrington from New Hampshire. He was cordial, always had been. But his tone was that of someone offering advice she hadn't asked for. "You know," he said, shifting a file between his hands, "maybe don't lean so hard into this one. It's education. It gets parents anxious. No one wants to feel like they're raising their kids wrong." She stared at him for a beat, then said, "Maybe no one wants to feel like their kids are being taught they didn't exist." Carrington blinked, smiled, said nothing, and walked away. That week, Jasmine returned to her district in Texas. She toured schools, met with teachers, sat in on a 7th grade class where the students were reading an abridged version of To Kill a Mockingbird. Afterward, one of the students, an 11-year-old girl with dark-rimmed glasses and a quiet voice, asked her why the book was always about a white lawyer saving black folks and not the other way around. Jasmine didn't have an answer, not one that fit neatly inside a sentence. Later that day, she visited a high school on the east side of Dallas. There, a Black history elective had been quietly removed after parents filed complaints about a lesson on redlining. The teacher, Janice Howell, 43, exhausted but sharp, told Jasmine that no one had even asked her side. The principal said it wasn't about race, just curriculum balance. "I've been balanced out of the building," Miss Howell said, trying to laugh. But Jasmine saw the crack in her voice, the kind that didn't show up in committee hearings or media summaries, the kind that only the dismissed could recognize in each other. By the time Jasmine flew back to Washington, She had gathered more than 80 letters from teachers, students, and parents. She carried them in her briefcase, not to wave, not to weaponize, but because they felt like anchors. Each word, written in shaky middle school handwriting or weary cursive, told a story the bill sought to erase. One letter stood out. It came from a 7th grade boy named Caleb, who wrote on lined notebook paper with the corners torn. "Dear Congress, my teacher told me not to write this, but I wanted to. If you take out the parts of history where people like me got hurt, does that mean we're not supposed to be here? I feel invisible in history class. And when I'm invisible, I don't know where to stand. Sincerely, Caleb J." Jasmine read that letter on the plane, then again on the drive home, then again as she sat in her office alone at 11:42 p.m. The building was mostly dark. The city was quiet. But in her chest, something had begun to build. Not rage, not even anger. Focus. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't shake, doesn't break the table. It sharpens. When Johnson held a press conference the next morning, Jasmine stood in the back of the room. She wasn't invited. She didn't need to be. From behind a column, she watched as he spoke of protecting children from politicized classrooms, of reclaiming innocence, and removing guilt-based narratives from American education. Cameras rolled. Applause rose. The same faces nodded. The same words echoed. Jasmine said nothing. But in her mind, one phrase repeated like a quiet drum beat beneath the noise. "I feel invisible in history class." It wasn't just a letter. It was a compass. And Jasmine Crockett had just decided where she would aim it. The committee chamber smelled like stale air and polished wood. Jasmine Crockett had sat in it 100 times before, but today the chairs felt colder, not physically, emotionally. Like the space had been designed not to hold people, but to contain them. Across the table, Speaker Mike Johnson beamed as another congressman lauded the Reverence in Education Act as a restoration of traditional values. There was laughter-tight, professional chuckles. Jasmine didn't laugh. She sat straight, fingers laced, the curve of her mouth soft but unreadable. To anyone watching, she looked calm. But calm isn't the same as untouched. Inside, she felt the slow accumulation of dismissal. Not dramatic, not explosive, just subtle, controlled, the way a smile becomes a wall when used to silence someone. The way eye contact becomes a weapon when it refuses to acknowledge you. She had made comments in previous sessions, small objections, questions about implementation, about how the bill would be interpreted. Each time, she was interrupted before finishing. Not harshly, not rudely, just efficiently. Johnson would smile, tilt his head slightly, say something like, "Let's not stray into hypotheticals," or, "We want to keep this discussion solution-focused." He never raised his voice, never called her out. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Her questions were inconvenient, her presence tolerated, her voice optional. And Jasmine knew how that worked, how systems wrapped condescension in politeness and called it balance. She'd learned it early, in law school, in courtrooms, in campaign meetings where donors leaned in a little too closely and used the phrase, "You're so articulate," like it was a prize. She smiled through all of it. Not because she liked it, but because the alternative was being labeled angry. And angry black women didn't get to pass amendments. They got headlines. They got reduced to sound bites. They got silenced in stereo. So Jasmine stayed calm. And when she returned to her office, she didn't vent. She filed. She logged every moment, every interruption, every subtle reframe. Her staff didn't need to ask why. They'd seen this playbook before. 2 weeks passed. The bill gained momentum. Conservative media lit up with headlines praising a return to truth in education. Talk show hosts held up the bill like it was scripture. State lawmakers across the South and Midwest began drafting parallel versions. A cultural tidal wave disguised as legislative reform. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept attending sessions. She kept smiling. But at night, she read. She read about the Freedmen's Bureau, about the lynching records that were quietly defunded from public databases, about the Texas textbook that referred to enslaved Africans as workers. She reread Caleb's letter. She memorized it. One evening, her chief of staff, Marina, found her sitting in the dark, the only light coming from her laptop screen. "You okay?" Marina asked. Jasmine nodded. "Just thinking." "You've been thinking for 3 weeks." Jasmine looked up. Her voice was even. "They think this is about politics." Marina didn't reply. She didn't need to. Later that week, Jasmine met with a coalition of educators, black, brown, indigenous, many of whom had flown in on their own dime. They weren't lobbyists, they weren't polished, they were tired. Miss Marisol Perez from El Paso broke down while describing how she had to remove her unit on Japanese internment camps after one parent complained it felt too negative. Mr. Kwame Barlow, a high school principal from Atlanta, described how 3 teachers in his district had resigned after being warned not to mention Jim Crow laws. Each story felt like a stone dropped in Jasmine's chest. "I had a student ask me if his ancestors were real," Miss Perez whispered, voice shaking, "because they're not in the textbook anymore." Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't interrupt. She just wrote. And when the meeting ended, she hugged each of them, not like a politician, like a daughter of the same history. Then she went back to her office and pulled out the black hardshell case she hadn't opened since her campaign. Inside were notes, photos, letters from voters, some hopeful, some hurt. One from her grandmother, written when Jasmine was a first-year attorney. "Some people will clap when you win. Some will clap when you smile. But most won't clap until you survive them. Keep standing, even when they pretend you're not." The next morning, she showed up to the committee hearing early. Not for drama, for position. She sat in the 3rd chair from the end, strategic, visible but not centered. Johnson wouldn't be able to ignore her presence, not without effort. The session was titled Review of Educational Neutrality Standards, Phase 2. The wording was vague, by design. When Johnson entered, he greeted everyone by name, everyone but her. She didn't flinch. She had her notes. She had Caleb's letter folded in her jacket. She had a USB drive from a retired Department of Education staffer who said, "I can't sleep at night knowing what they're trying to bury." She hadn't opened it yet. She was waiting for the moment. Across the room, a junior congressman from Indiana leaned over and whispered, "You good?" Jasmine smiled. "I'm listening." He nodded, uncertain. Because listening was what people did when they didn't plan to act. But Jasmine wasn't just listening. She was waiting. And that waiting carried a weight no one else in that room could see. Over the next 48 hours, the bill advanced out of subcommittee. Johnson gave a press conference flanked by parents holding signs that read, "Protect our kids from politics," and "Teach love, not shame." Jasmine watched from her office. No expression, just eyes locked on the screen. The words rolled by like static wrapped in scripture. In a brief moment of reflection, a journalist asked him if the bill risked sanitizing history. Johnson replied, "We're not removing facts. We're just removing the emotional politics that cloud them." The words landed like acid. Jasmine paused the clip, rewound it, played it again. The emotional politics that cloud them. She didn't rage. She reached for her folder labeled Pedagogical Guidance, 1984, 2023, and flipped to a memo dated April 2017. "Do not present historical content that induces discomfort based on race, gender, or class." She highlighted it. She didn't say a word. But now, she had a pattern. That weekend, Jasmine flew back to Texas and met with a group of middle school students from the East Side Mentorship Initiative. The youngest, Ava, handed her a crumpled page filled with colored pencil drawings, black kids and brown kids and Asian kids in classrooms, their mouths drawn as X. "What's this?" Jasmine asked gently. Ava replied, "That's us in history class. They don't let us talk." Jasmine crouched down, met her eyes. "They will," she said. Not a promise. A declaration. When Jasmine returned to Washington that Monday, her staff found a new setup on her desk. 3 matte black folders. One labeled language, one labeled funding sources, and one blank. Her aide asked what the third one would be for. Jasmine didn't answer right away. Then she said, "For the things they didn't expect us to find." And with that, the silence she had carried for weeks through meetings, through mischaracterizations, through smiles and nods and interrupted sentences, became something else. Not rage, not resistance. Readiness. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't been quiet out of caution. She had been quiet out of calculation. And soon, that weight behind her smile would become something far heavier than they ever saw coming. The morning of the hearing began with a kind of overcast sky that made the Capitol dome look heavier than usual. Reporters filed in early, crowding the marble corridors of the Rayburn House office building. Microphones clipped, brows furrowed not out of anticipation, but habit. The session was slated to be procedural, a continued discussion of the Reverence in Education Act with a formal reading of the revisions. On paper, nothing dramatic. No subpoenas, no fireworks. The kind of hearing people skim through on C-SPAN, with the sound low. But Jasmine Crockett arrived late. 5 minutes past the gavel. She walked in without apology, dressed in solid black, not as performance, as posture. Her heels clicked across the floor like punctuation. In one hand, a black leather case. The same one she'd carried during her first House speech, tucked quietly behind her as cameras zoomed in on louder men. Mike Johnson glanced up as she entered. His expression didn't shift, not even a twitch. He knew the cameras were on. So did she. She took her seat without a word, set the case beside her, unlocked the clasps, waited. Across the aisle, Chairman Hemsworth cleared his throat and gave the ceremonial opening. This session will continue our review of House Bill 1247, titled The Reverence in Education Act. He paused. We are joined today by Speaker Johnson, who has graciously offered to begin with prepared remarks. The word graciously sat in Jasmine's chest like smoke. Johnson stood, adjusted his microphone, and began in the tone he had perfected, measured, earnest, calculated to sound unrehearsed. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, guests watching from across the nation, today I bring forward not just a policy but a principle. Our classrooms are places of learning, not of division. We must protect our children from ideological overreach, from narratives that teach them to distrust their nation, their parents, even themselves. He paused, letting the silence fill with moral gravity. Then, as Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The Republican flank nodded as if they'd just been led in prayer. The chamber lights softened. Jasmine said nothing, but her hand moved slowly, deliberately to the latch on the leather case. She flipped it open. The first folder was labeled Language, the second, Funding Sources, the third, Draft Revisions. But she didn't open them, not yet. Instead, she reached into the side sleeve and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, the one Caleb had written. As Johnson launched into a description of the bill's benefits, restoring dignity to the American educational experience, Jasmine unfolded the letter, laid it gently on the table, glanced down at the name at the bottom, Caleb J. Chairman Hemsworth turned toward her after Johnson finished. Congresswoman Crockett, any preliminary comment before we begin review? She looked up. Not performatively, not sharply, just directly. Her voice, when it came, was even. I do. She didn't clear her throat, didn't shuffle papers, just reached forward and pressed a small silver button on the panel in front of her. The screen behind the dais lit up not with a document, but a video thumbnail, black frame, white timestamp in the corner, captioned, Meeting Room B, Private Caucus Discussion, May 12th. The title sent a ripple through the staffer row. Jasmine didn't explain. She didn't need to. She tapped the play icon. The room filled with the grainy audio of a hidden recording. It wasn't illegal. The session had been held in a government office, but it wasn't public, and Johnson knew it. Voices crackled, laughter, papers shuffled. Then his voice, clear, undeniable. We need this bill framed as unity, not control. No one's going to back a law that says we're cutting Black history. But you call it restoring moral clarity? That plays. Laughter followed. Then another voice, unidentified but familiar, asked, "And the language on slavery?" Johnson again. Cut anything that makes kids feel inherently guilty. We don't need emotional history, just the basics. You give them too much context, they start asking the wrong questions. The playback ended. Not with a boom. With stillness. The kind of stillness that rearranges oxygen. Across the room, Johnson's hands remained folded, but his thumbs had stopped moving. That mattered. Jasmine let the silence breathe. Then she said, "Mr. Speaker, when you say emotional history, do you mean accurate history?" He didn't respond. She turned to the panel. That recording was taken during a May session involving policy advisors and members of the bill's language team. It was submitted to my office by a government employee who asked not to be named, but who sat in that room. I verified its authenticity with a timestamp and cross-reference log from the building's access records. Still no sound. Then Jasmine reached for folder 1. Language. She opened it, revealed a printout of the bill's draft, revisions specifically, the passages deleted before public release. She read aloud. Removed. Slavery as a foundational economic force in early American development. Removed. Federal housing policies that led to redlining and generational wealth gaps. Removed. The civil rights movement as an example of structural resistance. She looked up. These were not removed for clarity, they were removed for comfort. A few seats down, a young intern scribbled notes so fast their pen slipped off the page. Johnson finally spoke. His voice was calm, composed. "Congresswoman Crockett, I won't debate tactics, but let me be clear. This bill is about protecting children from divisiveness, from being made to feel ashamed of who they are." Jasmine leaned forward, not aggressively, like a surgeon inspecting an incision. "And who do you believe feels ashamed when students learn about redlining, Mr. Speaker? The children of the families who were redlined, or the children of those who benefited from it?" He blinked, and that was enough. Then she reached for folder 2, funding sources. She opened it to a single-page memo marked "Confidential" in the top corner. It listed a series of donations made to the bill's drafting committee by an organization named American Legacy Institute. It sounded benign, but Jasmine had traced the 501 filings. American Legacy Institute, she said, is a registered affiliate of the States of Faith Coalition in Education lobbying group that has publicly campaigned for the removal of civil rights curriculum in 4 states, and has described multiculturalism as a corrosive influence on patriotism. She paused. They contributed 137.0 in indirect support to the development of this legislation. Gasps didn't come, but a few pens stopped moving. Jasmine looked directly at Johnson. "You said this bill was about moral clarity, but morality is not funded by silence." Just then, from the back of the room, a figure stood. It wasn't on the witness list. It wasn't planned, but the chair didn't object. It was Dr. Lena Whitaker, former Director of Inclusive Curriculum for the Department of Education. She had resigned the previous year quietly, without press, after clashing with the advisory board over the removal of racial justice modules from national teaching standards. She walked to the microphone, hands shaking, but not from fear, from decades of restraint. "My name is Dr. Whitaker," she began, "and I was asked to review the early drafts of this bill under the assumption it would strengthen civic education." She took a breath. "But when I saw what was being stripped away, what voices were being erased, I realized this wasn't about education. It was about erasure." Jasmine didn't smile, but her fingers relaxed. Dr. Whitaker placed a small black USB drive on the table. This contains 42 emails and internal memos from the department showing explicit collaboration between outside lobbying groups and the Speaker's office in crafting language that would remove references to Black, Native, and immigrant history from national education guidelines. The room held its breath. Someone dropped a pencil. A page whispered, "This is going to be a problem." Johnson didn't move. But the cameras turned. They had their story. Jasmine spoke one more time quietly. She reached into her jacket and placed Caleb's letter on the table in front of her. "This," she said, tapping it gently, "is from a child, a 7th grader, who asked if he was invisible." Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened. "And I'm here to tell him no." She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. But the mask had slipped. Not hers. Theirs. And what lay beneath was not moral clarity. It was curated amnesia. And Jasmine Crockett had just turned on the light. There are moments in a room when nothing moves, not even the air. This was one of them. The USB drive sat motionless on the witness table, but it may as well have been a ticking clock. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't gestured, hadn't made a scene, and yet she had taken the room apart, thread by thread, not with fire, with facts. And now came the silence. Not the anticipatory silence that waits for drama. The reverent kind, the kind that follows a scalpel when it's touched something vital. Speaker Mike Johnson didn't say a word. His hands remained clasped in front of him, jaw set, eyes still locked forward. But something had changed. His thumbs were no longer moving. That subtle, unconscious twitch of confidence had frozen, not because of a yell, but because the truth had been named aloud, and once it's named, it cannot be unspoken. Jasmine waited, not out of hesitation, out of calculation. She knew the timing of things. She knew that when power starts to fray, the instinct is to speak to fill the room with noise, to reclaim space. But she didn't give Johnson that room. She let the weight linger, let the air stay thick, let the silence stretch just enough to reveal who squirmed first. It wasn't her. Chairman Hemsworth adjusted his glasses. "We'll move now to general questions," he said, his voice uneven. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She gently raised her hand. "Mr. Chairman, before we proceed, I'd like to enter a brief statement into the record." He hesitated. Granted. Jasmine didn't stand. She didn't need height to command gravity. Instead, she opened the third folder, the one labeled Draft Revisions. It looked ordinary. Page after page of black and white markup, line edits, proposed deletions. But her hand rested on the top corner, as if holding something far heavier. She began softly, but clearly. "Mr. Johnson," she said, eyes meeting his for the first time in nearly 20 minutes, "you've framed this legislation as a defense of children. You've spoken of unity, of moral clarity, of protecting students from shame." He nodded, faintly, but she wasn't done. "And yet this bill removes the very tools that help children understand themselves, removes language about redlining, about Jim Crow, about the Trail of Tears, about Japanese internment. Not to protect them, but to shield others from discomfort." Her finger tapped the page once. "That is not education. That is curation." A rustle moved through the room like wind through dry grass. Jasmine continued. "I've reviewed the internal edits. Page 47, Section 8. You struck a paragraph that included this sentence, 'History should be taught in its full complexity, including the painful legacies that shape the present.'" She turned the page. In its place, you inserted, "History must foster pride in American values and unity of civic purpose." She paused. "That's not rewriting. That's rebranding." Then she leaned back, just slightly, enough to create space between her and the microphonizo, that her next words wouldn't sound amplified by tech, but by truth. "And so I have one question for you, Mr. Johnson." Her tone did not rise. It sharpened. "Do you believe that truth makes children dangerous?" It was not a gotcha. It was not even rhetorical. It was a mirror held so still that it reflected more than faces, it reflected fear. Johnson blinked. Then came the rehearsed smile, the one he wore like armor. "I believe children should be taught to love their country," he replied, "and not be burdened with narratives that make them feel ashamed to be American." Jasmine didn't blink. Instead, she reached to her left and pulled out one more document, not a memo, not a legal brief. A letter, the same one. Caleb J., age 12. She didn't hold it up like a weapon. She read from it like a prayer. "If you take out the parts of history where people like me got hurt, does that mean we're not supposed to be here? I feel invisible in history class. And when I'm invisible, I don't know where to stand." She looked back at Johnson. "And what, Mr. Speaker, do you say to that child?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because anything he said would require one of two things: honesty or performance. And the room had seen enough of the second to no longer believe it could mask the absence of the first. Jasmine didn't press. She let the question sit, like dust on a polished table, undeniable when the light hits it. The Republican flank tried to shift the momentum. Representative Hall from Missouri chimed in. "With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett, many parents across this country don't want their kids exposed to politically charged content." Jasmine turned her gaze slowly, precisely. "And is slavery politically charged?" she asked. Hall opened his mouth, then closed it. Then Johnson tried again. He leaned forward, voice softer now, edges dulled but deliberate. "This is not about denying history," he said. "It's about ensuring history does not divide us. It's about hope, unity, building a shared narrative." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. A shared narrative requires shared ownership. This bill strips ownership from the people whose stories made this country what it is without their consent, and now without even their acknowledgement. Then, without changing tone, she added, "You cannot edit your way to justice." The journalist gallery had gone still. Every pen poised, every recorder blinking. Jasmine inhaled Onsidip, quiet, stabilizing. Then she reached behind her and pressed a small button on her monitor. The screen lit up again. This time, not with a recording, with a timeline. A visual chart, color-coded. Title: Historical Removals by Bill Draft, March to July. It showed date by date how key pieces of American history had been pulled. March 14. Removal of Tuskegee Experiment. April 7. Redlining and housing discrimination struck from federal curriculum. May 12. Replacement of Trail of Tears with relocation campaign. June 3. Civil rights movement language softened from resistance to response. Jasmine pointed to the screen. "These are not accidents. These are edits. And each one is a blade not against politics, but against memory." Then she stood, not out of anger, out of necessity. She walked to the center of the room and turned, not toward the panel but toward the gallery, toward the people who hadn't spoken, the students watching, the parents scrolling, the teachers who had already been silenced. And she spoke not like a politician but like a teacher who refused to hand out a sanitized syllabus. "We are not here to protect feelings. We are here to protect facts." Pause. If a child learns about injustice and feels uncomfortable, that is not a failure of the curriculum. That is the beginning of conscience. Pause again. You cannot legislate away reflection, and you should never be afraid of a child learning the truth unless you benefit from the lie. She walked back to her seat, folded Caleb's letter once, then again, tucked it back into her jacket pocket. Not to hide it, to carry it. Mike Johnson's face had stiffened, not from guilt, from calculation. He knew the cameras were on, knew that clips would spread, knew that Jasmine hadn't just challenged a bill. She had punctured a persona. The chairman tried to close the session, but Jasmine raised one final point. "I'd like to enter one last item into the record," she said. She held up a still image, a photograph of a classroom wall in Alabama. The banner read, "Our Founding Fathers, brave, bold, brilliant. But beneath it, the textbooks had been redacted. Entire paragraphs blacked out. "We're not debating theory," Jasmine said. "We're documenting outcome." The session ended with a gavel that felt more like a retreat than a conclusion. And when Jasmine Crockett left the chamber, she did so the same way she entered. Without raising her voice, without breaking composure, without asking for applause. But something in the air had changed. Not because she shouted, because she didn't need to. Her words had cut through not just the bill but the mythology that wrapped around it. And the wound they left behind? It bled something long denied. Recognition. The hearing ended at 4:12 p.m. The hall emptied slowly, not from apathy but caution, like people leaving the site of a controlled detonation. Staffers whispered into phones. Journalists typed faster than they could think. And still, Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She sat quietly as aides gathered folders. The room buzzed around her, but she stayed still, not frozen, rooted. Mike Johnson had left minutes earlier, flanked by handlers and a silence he couldn't disguise. His voice, which had once filled churches and podiums with polished certainty, had fractured in the final hour not from volume, but from contact with something it couldn't absorb: consequence. And that consequence had a name. Caleb. 12 years old, one letter. And now through Jasmine's voice a country had been forced to see him. That night, the video clip hit social media before the sun fully set. It wasn't edited. It didn't need to be. Just Jasmine's calm voice, holding Caleb's letter in one hand and speaking directly into the silence. "Do you believe truth makes children dangerous?" No dramatics, no music. Just a question that thudded into the national bloodstream like a moral arrhythmia. By midnight, the clip had passed 20 million views, not because it was shocking, but because it was steady. Because people recognized the tone in Jasmine's voice as something they'd heard before, but only in private. A teacher refusing to lie, a mother refusing to look away, a child finally asking why they had to disappear to be accepted. Across the country, echoes began. At a high school in Birmingham, Alabama, a teacher printed out Caleb's letter and posted it on her classroom door. No caption, just the words. At a PTA meeting in Detroit, a father stood up and read Jasmine's question aloud, then looked at the superintendent and said, "Well?" In Chicago, in Oakland, in Tallahassee, students began organizing quiet walkouts, not with chants, but with silence. They sat in halls and read banned paragraphs from textbooks aloud. Each reading ended the same way. "I feel invisible in history class. And when I'm invisible, I don't know where to stand." The sentence had become a mirror and too many recognized themselves in it. Mike Johnson's office released a brief statement 2 days later. "Speaker Johnson remains committed to protecting American values in the classroom and will not be distracted by politicized rhetoric designed to divide." But the response fell flat. Because this time, the division hadn't come from a protester or a pundit. It had come from a letter written in pencil, from a child, and Jasmine hadn't shouted it. She'd read it. And the country had listened. 3 days after the hearing, the Washington Post published an investigative piece tracing the funding trails of the Reverence in Education Act. The article confirmed what Jasmine had already exposed: a coordinated push by national lobbying groups to erase the language of systemic harm from federal curriculum guidelines. The headline was clinical. Faith-based group spent $3.2 million on curriculum reform targeting race, gender, history. But the subhead carried the blow. Legislation framed as unity was built on erasure. In the wake of the article, 2 education consultants from the Department of Education resigned. A whistleblower hotline set up by the Congressional Ethics Office received over 300 tips in 72 hours. Several school boards suspended implementation of newly aligned state education bills pending clarification. Behind closed doors, Johnson's staff scrambled. His media appearances were canceled, first quietly, then in waves. Requests for comment were deflected with legal jargon. His once airtight network of political allies began issuing tepid public statements. We support truth in education, but believe more transparency is always helpful. No one defended him outright, because no one wanted to carry the echo. But Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't post a clip. She didn't appear on late-night television. She didn't host a press conference. Instead, she returned to Texas. There, she met with a group of students who had watched the hearing live. They were 12, 13, 14, some quiet, some fiery. All of them black, brown, immigrant, working class, and all of them trying to figure out what part of their story was allowed in the classroom. One girl, Ava, the same child who had once drawn a classroom full of X's for mouths, asked her a question. "Why didn't you yell at him?" Jasmine smiled. Not wide, not performative, just enough. "Because yelling isn't the only way to be loud," she said. Then she looked around the circle of kids, each one sitting cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed and waiting. Sometimes the truth is already loud. You just have to say it with both feet planted. In the days that followed, the clip of Jasmine's words began circulating in unexpected places: seminaries, civic centers, even conservative forums, not because they agreed with her, but because they couldn't dismiss her. There was no snark in her tone, no finger-wagging, no gotcha moment. Just that question: do you believe truth makes children dangerous? And the long, empty silence that followed. CNN requested an interview. She declined. Fox News invited her for a clarifying discussion. She declined that, too. Instead, she issued a written statement, published quietly on her congressional website. No logo, no banner, just a single page titled, "Why I Spoke." It read, "This was never about punishing anyone. This was never about theater. This was about a boy who wrote a letter. And how many more children are silently asking the same thing? If this made you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. The truth shouldn't be silent just because it hurts." The post went viral. Not because it screamed, because it didn't. That week, 3 major school districts across the country announced a pause in curriculum changes related to the Reverence in Education guidelines. A coalition of teachers launched a campaign titled, "Let Us Teach." It featured educators holding signs with Caleb's words. One post simply showed a desk, an empty chair, and a paper on top that read, "I feel invisible in history class. Caleb J., 12. The caption, "He deserves to be seen." Inside Capitol Hill, the political calculus began to shift. Johnson still held his title, but something had cracked, not just his credibility, but his insulation. A senior advisor resigned without notice. Funders began to call with questions they used to ignore. One longtime supporter anonymously told The Hill, "This isn't going away. She didn't just hit a nerve. She named it." 1 week after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood in her office, looking out the window. The Capitol dome stood in sharp contrast against the dusk. She held no binder, no speech. Just Caleb's original letter. She reread it. Not because she forgot what it said, because she needed to remember how it felt the first time she held it, how heavy a few pencil lines could be when written by someone who didn't know their words would ever leave the page. Behind her, Marina entered. "We just got confirmation," her chief of staff said softly. "The department is reopening the review process." Jasmine didn't turn. She nodded, then asked, "What about him?" Marina paused. "Caleb's mom says he wants to write a new letter, this time to you." Jasmine smiled. This time, a little wider. "Tell him I'll write back." By the end of the month, a Congressional Ethics Subcommittee had opened an inquiry into the Reverence in Education Act, not because of the funding, not because of the edits, because of the intent. Because, as Jasmine had made clear, the most dangerous thing in a classroom isn't what's taught. It's what's deliberately left out. She returned to the House chamber weeks later for a different hearing. The chair was the same, the lighting unchanged. The flags still flanked the walls. But one thing was different: the empty seat. Mike Johnson's nameplate remained on the table, but the chair was cold, vacant. The speaker was on leave pending legal consultation per his office. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed. Jasmine walked in, binder in hand, not to finish something, to start something new. And so the echo remains. Not just in the clip, not just in the headlines, in the quiet decision of a child to write a letter, in the calm voice of a woman who didn't need to shout, and in the silence that followed a silence that was not absence, but consequence. Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a bill. She confronted a belief that truth must be trimmed for comfort, that voices must whisper to be heard, that discomfort must be avoided at all costs. And she replaced it with something else. A conviction that could not be redacted, that could not be spun, that could not be ignored. Truth doesn't need permission. It just needs someone steady enough to carry it. And Jasmine did. So when people ask how it all collapsed, they'll point to folders and footage and timelines. But the real answer will be simpler. A boy wrote a letter. A woman read it out loud. And the country finally listened. Sometimes, the loudest moment in the room is the one where no one says a word. A boy asked why he felt invisible, and a woman chose not to answer with anger, but with evidence, letting the truth walk in, calmly, and take its seat. And maybe that's what justice looks like in real life, not a grand speech, not a dramatic headline, but a steady hand holding a forgotten name to the light and refusing to let it fade. Have you ever been in a room where you had something to say, but weren't sure the silence would let you? If you have, know this: your voice doesn't have to be loud to matter. It just has to be yours. So hold your ground, speak your truth, not to burn things down, but to make space for the stories that were never supposed to disappear. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, take a moment, share it with them. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next time someone stands up and the room learns to listen. We read every comment, every story, and every moment of truth you bring. Your words matter here. Because as Jasmine Crockett showed us, you cannot edit your way to justice. We'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.